Do you think that the debate on abortion today, framed as a pro-choice versus pro-life, is the proper way to discuss this topic?
Well, not entirely. I think that the pro-life supporters, I think, are right to say that they are pro-life. I think that's true. And I'd say that for the pro-choice label, I think can be a little bit misleading because I'm pro-choice about a lot of things. Depending on what you're choosing. So it's I'm in favor of the right to choose is an incomplete sentence. It's the right to choose what is you have to complete that in order for somebody to offer an opinion about that. So people who are pro-life are often made out to be anti-choice, when we're really in favor of autonomy for a whole lot of things. It's just, I don't favor a woman having a choice to end the life of her offspring. And if that's the choice. So it just depends. Say you're pro-choice depends on what you choose.
It seems that one of the issues that is being debated time after time is the question, when is the moment that the fetus becomes a human being? And as you know, many alternative views are offered, such as the moment of viability, for instance, or the brain activity, or when the unborn starts quickening, or when implantation happens. And there are also others who say that the unborn becomes a human being only at birth. So according to your research, what do you think is the decisive moment?
I think there's only one place where you can assign human personhood that's not arbitrary, and that's at conception. Because implantation is just a change of location. Same for birth. Viability says nothing about the nature of the unborn child. Viability is a commentary on medical technology. Quickening is just when the woman feels the baby moving around, which requires motion and things like that. But we all know that a woman is pregnant long before she first feels the movement of the baby. So there's really no place other than conception that I think makes any sense. Because at conception, that unborn child has all the capacities that they will ever have. It's just what and I think it's the way we talk about this matters, because I would not say that embryos develop into fetuses or embryos become fetuses. The better way to say that is that embryos mature into fetuses, which mature into newborns, mature into toddlers. So they're maturing according to what they already are from the very start.
If I'm not wrong, you started as a biblical scholar and then went to ethics and still involves the biblical studies in it. But I want to ask you, does the Bible speak about abortion? Have the biblical writers commented on this topic?
Indirectly, yes. No place in the scripture says thou shalt not have an abortion. But the biblical teaching is very clear that from the early stages of pregnancy, you have a full person, image of God bearing unborn child. Psalm 139, for example, is I think the best example on this, where David affirms that even when he as a person was in his mother's womb in an unformed state, which because they didn't have ultrasound technology, that's the only way the biblical writers knew how to talk about it, was in that early state before the unborn child came to resemble anything looking like a human being. It was still a person with whom with whom God had a relationship and a plan. You see this bearing out as well in the early chapters of Luke, in the infancy narratives of Jesus, where Mary discovers that she is pregnant immediately after becoming impregnated, which is kind of unusual. That most women don't find out until about 6 weeks to 2 months after conception's occurred, and then when she's maybe 5 days, a week pregnant, she goes to visit her sister-in-law Elizabeth and announces that she's pregnant, and the celebration that ensues is such that the Messiah has come. There was another celebration when Jesus was born, but it's really clear that from a week at pregnancy, the person she was carrying was a full image of God-bearing person. So, the biblical writers didn't address the notion of embryos outside the womb because there was no such possibility. So I think it's unrealistic to expect the Bible to speak to any of that. But I think where they do speak to it, they are pretty clear and unreserved that from the very early points of pregnancy, you have a full person.
I mean, you know very well that pregnancy can happen in some very unfortunate ways. For example, do you still oppose abortion even in the case of a pregnancy resulting from rape?
If somebody asked me, is it morally right or morally acceptable to compound one act of violence with another, I would say no. What I would encourage a woman to do who's been sexually assaulted and ends up pregnant, which is incredibly rare, by the way. One in probably 100,000 cases does that happen. But I would encourage her to keep the baby for the 9 months and put the baby up for adoption, as opposed to, ending the life of an unborn child through no fault of the child. Now, if she chose to do that, I would understand. I probably wouldn't give her a lot of grief about it. But I think for moral purposes, to say that that's morally acceptable, I think is a stretch, because I'd want to suggest that the means by which someone is conceived doesn't have anything to do with what kind of a thing they are. Whether the unborn child's a person or not has nothing to do with circumstances under which his or her conception took place.
It seems that it involves like an emotional decision and a moral act that's not based on the baby or on the unborn, but based on something previous.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And I understand why people take that into account. I would not say that's a decisive factor.
The abortion debate also involves discussion about reproductive technologies, and you also write this in your book. So what are some general principles that a couple should consider to avoid the dilemma of abortion when thinking of using those technology for reproduction?
Well, if it's true that embryos are people too, which they are, then any reproductive technology that where embryos are discarded, which is commonly the case in vitro fertilization, or where selective termination is performed, which is becoming less common today because physicians, I think, have a better sense that they shouldn't be implanting these multiple embryos. So I think we don't see as much of that selective termination today, which I think is a good thing. But I think with IVF, that is still clearly the case. That there are lots of, there are probably 500,000 frozen embryos in the United States today. I don't know about Albania. It's pretty clear, I think, that in order to maximize the success of IVF, you create as many embryos as you can. Get pregnant on the first try. If embryos left over, typically they just get discarded. And so couples should be, they should resolve, Christian couples should resolve, not to throw away embryos. They can either implant them themselves or they can give them up for embryo adoption, which in lots of parts of the world is a live option. I'm not so sure about what the situation in Albania would be on that. Mm-hmm. But they should also limit the number of embryos that are implanted to the number that the woman can safely carry and the number of children that they actually are willing to raise. Mm-hmm. So if she's really small and can't carry triplets, you shouldn't implant 3.
Giving the embryos for adoption compared to the option of killing the embryo, giving the embryo for adoption in itself, does it involve any ethical dilemma there?
Well, it's not ideal. Mm-hmm. The ideal is for the 2 parents whose genes generate the child, that there be continuity between procreation and parenting. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't necessarily call all breaks of that continuity unethical, because, there are lots of times that, families just are not able to provide adequate care for a child for a variety of reasons. And I think in this case, this is, the parents obviously are not unfit, but what they've determined is that those children would be better off for a childless couple than with them. Now, whether that's true or not, it's hard to make a blanket statement about that. What I would be nervous about is if I were putting those embryos up for adoption to a non-believing family, for example, or a single woman who's going to raise those kids by herself without a dad. I think those situations, that becomes very problematic.